organisers, Dr. Pinson, Professor McGrath, for this humblingly large stage and this terrifyingly knowledgeable audience. I have to confess up front that transhumanism isn't my speciality, so I ask for preemptive forgiveness for any caricatures or bits of the literature that I'm missing. My own research kind of focuses on embodied cognition, which I'll talk more about, and I hope that this really kind of neighbouring discipline can bring some fresh perspectives on the thinking that we're doing here for these 2 days. So the territory I want to cover is basically these 5 points. First, I want to argue that many transhumanist accounts have a very organism-centric view of enhancement. That is, they primarily conceive of enhancement in terms of augmentation to or a replacement of the biological body or brain. We've heard quite a bit of that throughout the day. Second, I want to introduce very quickly a distributed account of cognition, which argues that a lot of human cognitive processes rely on environmental scaffolding. And consequently, point 3, to say that this distributed picture means perhaps we need to have a distributed account of what might count as an enhancement. Fourthly, on this distributed picture, I want to kind of boldly and provocatively propose that perhaps even religion might count as an enhancement. And then finally, I'll conclude by sketching some of the implications for the debate between theology and transhumanism. So take your popular cyborg or transhumanist pictures of technological enhancement, and you'll get some kind of mixture of tissue and metal, blood and circuitry, biology and machinery. We've seen plenty of examples throughout the day. One of the inherent assumptions, I think, in here is that if you want to enhance the mind, then just tinker with the brain. If you want to enhance physiology, perhaps longevity, tinker with the body. The biological wetware is upgraded, but the boundaries very much remain the same in the popular imagination. These same tendencies, I think, come across in some of the more formal and academic writing and thought on technological enhancement. So 2 quick quotes from the Transhumanist FAQ, which we've already heard from. Just as we use rational means to improve the human condition and the external world, we also use such means to improve ourselves, the human organism. Note the equivalence between ourselves and our organism there. Secondly, radical technological modifications to our brains and bodies are needed. And this perhaps isn't terribly surprising when you consider the genealogy of transhumanism, the way it connects back to humanism. Janine's already outlined that for us this morning. And so Michael Burdett's really nice introduction to transhumanism provides exactly this kind of reflection. So whereas humanism sets itself the task of improving the human condition through education, art, politics, other cultural means, transhumanism applies this directly to the human organism. So it's a continuation of the focus on the individual that humanism and transhumanism continue to share. And this has affected the way that we think about enhancement. So this might be fine. We've kind of been going along with this for quite a while. But I want to suggest that if we think about cognition in a distributed fashion, then this might begin to look a bit more problematic. So a very simple but hopefully clear example, multiplying 2 numbers. 2 ways of doing it. First strategy on the left, simply multiply the numbers together in your brain. Problem, this becomes quite taxing on your working memory once the numbers get too big. And so as we all learnt in secondary school, you just do long multiplication. You use a pen and a paper and multiply at single digits using a set process, and you manage to achieve the cognitive task. So the question that's posed here is, where is the cognitive process in the second instance? It's clear that the brain is obviously involved. It's orchestrating the process. It's multiplying individual digits using memory and perhaps other techniques. But are the hand, pen, and paper also part of the picture here? Perhaps this case generalizes to many more cases. Here's a quote from Andy Clark, who suggests that the distinctive way in which human brains repeatedly create and exploit various species of cognitive technology so as to expand and reshape the space of human reason. We, more than any other creature on the planet, deploy non-biological elements, instruments, media, notations, to complement our basic biological modes of processing, creating extended cognitive systems whose computational and problem-solving profiles are quite different from those of the naked brain. So perhaps there are all kinds of cognitive processes that use environmental scaffolds. Clark, in his book, Being There, gives us a huge number of examples. And these aren't simply just one-off tools that we approach and use, but they sometimes become highly integrated into our everyday functioning. I spoke to a conference participant this morning who said he felt disabled because he was unable to get Wi-Fi, which points to the reliance we sometimes have on technology and other environmental scaffolds that we use in cognitive processes. There are some big metaphysical questions that are asked here and critiques which I won't get into, and it may sound like quite a radical proposal, but actually if you take the analogy of evolutionary biology, I think they begin to look a lot less radical. Evolutionary biologists some 30 or 40 years ago began to realize that if you just, well, longer than 30 or 40 years ago as well, began to realize that if you just look at the human organism as an isolated individual, that's a very limiting perspective. And so we have all kinds of biological concepts, such as the extended phenotype, niche construction, symbiosis and mutualism, now the extended evolutionary synthesis, which all are really productive ways of understanding organisms within their particular ecologies and environments. And so you can think of this distributed picture as simply cognitive science catching up with the biology and thinking about broader systems. Okay, so on this distributed picture, we might need to rethink enhancement. If extrasomatic resources are functionally similar to neural ones, enhancement may not be limited to alterations within the skin or skull. I thought I was the first to make this connection between distributed cognition and enhancement, only to read Janine's book and discover that Andy Clark had written a whole book about it 15 years ago. So you're going to get quite a bit of Andy Clark in the first half of the talk. Here's some words from his introduction. I'm slowly becoming more and more a cyborg. So are you. Without the need for wires, surgery, or bodily alterations. Perhaps we already are. For we shall be cyborgs not in the merely superficial sense of combining flesh and wires, but in the more profound sense of being human technology symbionts. Thinking and reasoning systems whose minds and selves are spread across biological brain and non-biological circuitry. So Clark here is arguing that we are, as the title of his book suggests, natural-born cyborgs. We are already incorporating a huge number of technologies into our cognitive capacities. It's just that they haven't all penetrated beneath our skin or into our skull. He gives many examples. The book is 15-year-old, so some of them are now amusingly 15 years out of date. He waxes lyrical about the amazing new Nokia 5510, which combines a phone, MP3 player, FM radio, messaging machine, and gaming console. So there's a nostalgia trip for some of you. But he also points to other technologies that are really just coming to the fore now: augmented reality, smart worlds and transparent computing, what we might call the Internet of Things, which are really beginning to change the way in which our environments are structured and we go about the cognitive tasks that we perform on an everyday basis. There is simply nothing new about human enhancement, Clark goes on to say. So what might this more distributed picture of enhancement look like? Another lengthy Clark quote, which I won't read out, but needless to say is that it may include all kinds of scaffolding. He mentions art, science, education, and culture, social, technological, and cultural scaffoldings. Here's a much broader picture of what an enhancement what might count as an enhancement once we no longer think that the skin is an absolute barrier or boundary of the human self. What's missing from Clark's picture, or is perhaps hidden away sneakily in the cultural category, which I want to push forward on today, is religion. Is religion also an enhancement? In some senses, people like Michel Foucault, Noah Feldman have already described religion as a technology. And if the skin is no longer a boundary relevant for deciding whether or not something is an enhancement, then what are the criteria we might use to decide whether something is or isn't an enhancement? Clark helpfully offers two. So the first criterion, the potential of the technology to become integrated so deeply and fluidly within our existing biological capacities and characteristics that we feel no boundary. So the question is, does religion fulfill this criterion? And I want to argue that aspects of it absolutely do. Aspects of religious devotion can become second nature. Religion can be absolutely central to one's identity, self-understanding, as documents like the UN Declaration of Human Rights recognize. Being prevented from practicing your religion can be profoundly alienating. So religion, it seems, can be deeply integrated into our everyday lives. Second criterion, the potential of such human-machine symbiosis to transform, for better or for worse, our lives, projects, and capacities. Again, I want to suggest that religion can fit the bill for this criterion. It absolutely often seeks to be transformative. It absolutely often seeks to direct people's projects, and we'll talk about their capacities a bit more. One might worry about the human-machine reference there and whether religion counts as a machine, but I think Clark intends this as a very broad category. And so, for example, in multiple places, he wants to argue that language is a kind of technology that has altered human cognition. And there's not an obvious mechanical aspect to that. So I think we can let the machine bit slide. Okay, what might these religious enhancements look like? Well, first, here's a very simple example to parallel the example of the long multiplication, right? You've got a bit of material culture that is used in prayer. It's used in many different religious traditions. And the idea is that different shapes of beads correspond to different kinds of prayer, the number of beads, the number of repetitions. So what you're doing here is offloading the need to keep track of where you're up to in this process, and you can simply use your thumb through the beads to do that, and that frees up your attention to pay attention elsewhere. Very simple but hopefully compelling example. Does this generalize? I want to suggest there are loads of places within religious practices that are replete with bodily manipulations and material culture which can influence cognition. This is where the embodied cognition literature comes in. Here's a scene of a religious ritual. It involves incense, which we know has a little positive affective boost. There's particular kinds of clothing, which we know can influence cognition. Bodily postures are used. We know that they can facilitate memory recall. There are gestures, synchronized movements, artistic representation, large spaces, which we know are awe-inspiring, that have all kinds of cognitive effects. So I want to suggest there's a plethora of ways in which religion might count as a distributed, enhancing technology. So if it's an enhancing technology, then what exactly does it achieve? Well, I've already noticed a number of potential effects that it might have in terms of influencing affect and emotion. Some studies, quite a number of studies, have identified that religious priming can have pro-social effects. So the so-called Sunday effect, that in this study they called people and asked for charitable donations and found that religious believers who'd been to a place of worship on Sunday morning were more likely to give on a Sunday than on other days. And so there's kind of altruism and pro-social enhancement perhaps taking place here. Another example is one in which participants were more likely to cooperate in a game if it was held in a chapel or a Hindu temple as opposed to a lecture hall. I don't want to be too Pollyanna-ish about how amazing religion can be. So some caveats to the kind of enhancements here. A couple of studies, one study which surveyed people's attitudes either in the presence of church buildings or in the presence of a secular building, and found in the presence of a church building, among other things, survey response had more negative attitudes towards non-Christians. A similar study found that if you showed the picture of a homeless person with a church in the background, people were more generous. But if you showed them a picture of an illegal immigrant with a church in the background, it didn't have the same effect. So the overarching story that's given here is that religious can prime pro-sociality, but sometimes it's only for in-groups and doesn't extend to out-groups. So this, of course, might seem highly problematic. It may explain Jeff Sessions, the US Attorney General, but to many of the rest of us who think that the Hebrew Bible has an ethic of care for alien and stranger, or the New Testament ethic of neighbor love extends to outsiders, or even a secular ethic which attempts to somehow universalize moral obligations, this can look not like an enhancement, but a problem. So to nuance this further again, here's another study on synchronous movement, which found that people who engage in synchronous movement, this is a very common feature of many religious rituals, as you will be aware, had high prosociality not only to fellow participants, but also to out-group members who weren't participating at all. So there are some mechanisms that may extend to out-groups. So the possibility here, I think, might, this kind of might raise a possibility for what I'm going to provocatively and deliberately provocatively call religious engineering. I think the term religious engineering is a nice one because it kind of has a technological edge and it fits right into this transhumanist discussion that we're having. It also flags some real problems. You might hear a connotation there with social engineering and wonder, well, who is this sinister group of people who's going to be doing the engineering? And that takes us back to last night's lecture and the worries that were expressed there. But nevertheless, it's interesting to think, do we engage in religious engineering? Do theologians who, for example, rightly or wrongly suggest that using icons in worship is idolatrous, engage in a form of religious re-engineering because they're trying to change religious material culture, which may influence the kind of cognitive processes that participants involved in those rituals experience? Does any theologian who has a hope of being read by religious adherents engage in religious engineering if they also hope that there'll be some kind of transformational influence experienced by their readers as a result of engaging with their theology? So that brings me to a few concluding implications I want to tease out for this picture of, firstly, distributed cognition, which will lead us to distributed enhancements. And once we have a distributed view of enhancements, perhaps religion as itself a kind of enhancement. So the first perhaps a little bit cheeky one is that it puts religious bioconservatives in a bind, because if you're going to say, no, we shouldn't enhance in any way, and it turns out that you yourself are engaging in enhancement and perhaps even promoting enhancement, then that obviously leads to some questions that might need to be answered. There probably aren't too many scholars who are right on the extreme and want to be complete bioconservatives, so that's a slightly cheeky implication. But one might extend this to language users, and this came up earlier in the day when we were talking about this question which the transhumanist FAQ often wants to avoid, namely, are we already transhuman in some interesting ways? A second set of implications for the theologians is I want to suggest that theologians aren't outsiders looking in. What I mean by this is that I think my feeling is that the posture that a lot of theologians take when engaging with transhumanism is one of the outsider. So they think of the social movements, like transhumanism, as being fundamentally secular. They think of the technologies as being fundamentally secular. And so the job is for us as theologians to come along and to look at these outside elements and to reflect upon them and to think about whether we should embrace them or reject them. And that kind of outsider coming to a kind of distantiated subject matter, I think, may be problematized if religion is already enhancement, because it means that theologians are already in the enhancement game. And that might change the way the discourse goes. Thirdly, just to make sure that I annoy absolutely everyone in the room, this might also cause a challenge to transhumanists. As is often pointed out, they typically take quite a dim view, by and large, of religion. But the question for them then becomes, why are you arbitrarily advocating for some kinds of enhancements and not other kinds of enhancements? Why aren't you technology neutral or agnostic in saying that any technology that will give us a good enhancement should be embraced? So those are my 3 tentative implications for how this picture might change the dialogue, and I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your paper. I'm not at all annoyed as a theologian. I liked it very much, perhaps because it reminded me of my own attempts, so this might come off as more of a comment than a question, but it really fascinates me that the media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who famously said the medium is the message, if anyone was attuned to the effects of material culture and how they affect our understandings of ourselves. McLuhan was certainly a post-human, but his comment, the medium is the message, he said, was strictly true of the Eucharist, and McLuhan was a devoted Catholic. So I'm just curious about how you see the ecclesiological minefield that follows from this comparative discussion between religion as enhancement and technology as enhancement. It seems to me that once you've drawn the terms of comparison in that way, you do end up seeking to assert some kind of efficaciousness to the technology, whether that be the liturgy of the Eucharist, and then you have to try and subordinate whatever it is we're doing with human enhancement technologies. Or you end up kind of in what you described as the transhumanist as an agnostic. You end up in the same boat as a theologian as an agnostic, towards the efficacy of all technologies, including religious ritual. But anyway, so it's more of a comment than anything, but if you want to talk about how many really distinct ecclesial questions it raises, it's very fascinating, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, it does raise a huge number of questions. I think that's absolutely right. A few things to say about that. The medium is a message. Yeah, I think that's something I really want to embrace when it comes to liturgy. And one of the things I've tried to tease out in my research is the fact that a lot of understandings and the meanings of liturgies is theorized in terms of purely symbolic forms. So what I mean by symbolic is that there's kind of an arbitrary meaning which is attached to a form by virtue of a historical convention, and that's how we think the meaning of the liturgy arises. And I think that's absolutely true. It happens in some cases, it's always present, but I think there are also embodied meanings which are inherent in the form of the liturgies that also supplement those kind of symbolic meanings. Goodness, there's a lot of other things I could say. I guess I think one danger that I think you've absolutely correctly hit upon is this problem of just instrumentalizing religion, perhaps. And I had meant to flag that in the thing. And so, yeah, I suppose to be clear, I don't want to say that religion is essentially a technology, or the essence of religion is that it's a technology to help us do other things. And to be far more circumspect and say that there are aspects of religion which do happen to have certain effects, but that's a far more piecemeal and fragmentary picture than saying, this is what religion's really about.
I enjoyed your presentation, but I'm left wondering, what is your understanding of technology? So, what is the definition of technology you're working with? Because depending on your definition of it, religion won't be a technology. So, for example, if you're working with Heidegger's understanding of technology, then these religious aids, such as the rosary, it's not a technology because it's not reducing, it down to a source of power, or, you also think of Jacques Ellul, where technology, it's really the logic behind it of efficiency, the drive for efficiency. And Ellul saw religious practices as a way of resisting that. So do you just think technology is any kind of material culture, any kind of material artifact, or do you think it's more of like an essence, as Heidegger would put it?
Yeah, again, a really perceptive question, and one I really struggled with in putting together the presentation and tried to paper over, but you've helpfully uncovered it for me. Thank you very much. I went to the dictionary definitions of technology, which often talk about the application of scientific knowledge. So perhaps if you want that kind of bland dictionary definition, I could say, well, I've got some scientific knowledge here that I'm trying to apply, and there's questions about the boundaries of science and of technology as well. I suppose I am assuming just a technology as something we use, tool as technology, which is quite a broad and generous definition probably, so that here I'm pointing to all kinds of material culture which are perhaps tools that do and change things, so instrumental in some ways, and therefore count as technologies on this really broad definition. But perhaps if you wanted to really tightly circumscribe what will count as a technology, I guess my pushback then would be, I think a lot of the times we assume really arbitrary boundaries around what we think of as a technology. We have intuitions that technologies are gadgets and computers and the kind of popular images that I put up right at the beginning. And so part of what I was trying to do is to question about whether those assumptions and intuitions about how we circumscribe what is technology are valid, and why not count other things as technologies if they have this instrumental bit to them, that they kind of function and do things for us.
So we've been cyborgs since we started cooking.
Yep, since we started using language, according perhaps, or even before that, according to Clark. Yep.
Just one more. Finny, you haven't spoken before, so. Thank you. Just wait for the microphone, please. Thank you for the paper. I think one of the realities that we have to deal with is the fact that we live in an environment that is saturated by institutions, various institutions, and so we are constantly being engineered, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so we are, in one sense, very engineered creatures. And so even the technologies that we use right now and that we'll use in the future are not because of some evolutionary progression that we naturally utilize these technologies, but we're engineered to utilize them by the institutions that have to gain by the usage of such technologies. And so there is a lot of complexity that comes in when we look at where this technological progression is taking us. Now, in terms of religion, I agree with you that there is an engineering that goes on, but I wonder if there's a distinction between improvement and enhancement. Because in religion, or in a religious context, or in the context of religious engineering, I think one of the focuses is to make us more human. In popular evangelical language, we call it discipleship. Whether it's praying the rosary, or meditation, or any of those other things that you talked about, pro-social behavior, the whole focus is to make us more human, not post-human. And so I would make the distinction between improvement and enhancement. And so you can still be involved in religious engineering and push back on enhancement that tries to make you post-human. So if you could comment a little bit more on that.
So I absolutely agree with you about the institutional context, and I think that's really one of the points I wanted to bring out in my point to theologians, that theologians have skin in the game, and so there are power dynamics at play. And so when we're talking about, is it the few engineering the many, that question equally applies to theological contexts. Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion of making a distinction between improvement and enhancement. I guess I'd have to think about that a bit more, but I guess I'd like to hear more about how exactly you're drawing that distinction, what makes something count as an improvement rather than an enhancement. I don't know whether you want to quickly clarify that.
So the improvement part in the religious or theological engineering would be to make you more human. And so that would go back into the creation plan and so on. I mean, it's a whole paradigm, right? And so it makes you more human. To become pro-social, to be involved in prayer and all of these things, prayer of the praying the rosary and so on, is really what you were meant to be as a human being. But then enhancement is focused on making you post-human. So it's kind of taking you beyond the original design plan. Obviously, this also brings in a clash of the various paradigms that'll be at work. So it's not a purely empirical question.
Yeah. So, yep, I agree with your characterization that there is a vision of what it means to be truly human, and that these are technologies aimed at trying to get us to that vision. I suppose because I'm dealing with psychology of religion, the kinds of effects they're seeing, like prosociality, are exactly, perhaps they are quite thin concepts that don't quite stack up to virtue, right? They're maybe you don't think prosociality equals generosity or caritas or agape, or pick whatever language you want to name your virtue in. I'm completely on board with that, but I suppose one of the things that makes me ponder about how exactly we can draw that distinction is the fact that best pills are doing the exact same thing of being more pro-social as a synchronized movement, which happens in rituals and in other contexts altogether. So I'm not sure that we can have such a hard and fast boundary between what happens inside ecclesial context and outside ecclesial context, given that the kinds of behaviors look very similar, at least from, maybe not in the terms of the bigger narrative that's being offered, and maybe that's where the differentiation comes in, but certainly in terms of the behaviors that you're seeing from a kind of empirical psychological perspective, which admittedly does take focus on very narrow and discrete and specific, and therefore fragmentary and piecemeal bits of religion, because it focuses really on these very discrete aspects of behavior. But I'd like to hear more about that improvement enhancement distinction. Thank you.
I think we're out of time now, but I would like to join me in thanking Tobias.